So first of all, thank you, Richard, for that introduction. Um, it's a real pleasure to be here with you. This is the first World War II book club that I've spoken to. I've spoken to other kind of regional book clubs, and I've spoken at the World War II Museum in New Hampshire, um, up there on Lake Winnipesaukee. But um, this is the first dedicated World War II audience, and I'm really delighted to be here because in many ways I feel that this book is a book that I wrote as someone trying to make arguments in the field of World War II history in particular. And what I do professionally now is look at the intersect of religion and intelligence, religion and espionage. I have backgrounds in kind of Holocaust studies, so I combined all of that and came up with this book, which I'll talk about. I kind of stumbled onto the topic. It eventually got published in late 2021 by Harvard University Press, and I'll be interested to get your feedback as World War II historians on what you think. So what I'm looking at is really the religious component, or a religious component, of the domestic scene in World War II in the United States, both prior to and during World War II. It deals with the topic of Catholic anti-Semitism and how I argue that Nazi intelligence in the United States managed to paramilitarize the anti-Semitism within the Catholic community at the time. And for some reason or another, which we can talk about, which I argue about in the book, this whole case kind of got forgotten. That's the subtitle of the book, is The Forgotten History of the Christian Front. And there are big questions about why this case was forgotten and who benefited from it being forgotten. So this is the cover of the book, the hard copy of the book. It'll be coming out in paperback in September. And the photo on the cover of the book shows Joe McWilliams, a New York member of the Christian Front, giving a stump speech in front of his Canastota wagon. He was actually a Christian Front candidate for Congress in New York. He was colloquially known as Joe McNazi. And this is the real Nazi. His name is Herbert Scholz. For World War II historians, many people have known about Scholz, but no one has treated him as a subject of scholarly investigation. So there have been references to Scholz here and there in the historiography, but no one actually attempted to uncover what he was doing as a spy master in Boston, which I talk about in the book. This is his agent, who he recruited, Francis Patrick Moran. He Irish immigrant background from Boston, and he was recruited by Scholz to be an agent. And it was this relationship between Scholz and Moran went undiscovered, unknown until the book was published. But I argue it was a very fruitful, secretive arrangement, clandestine arrangement between a spy and an agent. The title comes from the fact that Moran's organization, called the Christian Front, which operated both in New York and Boston, also Philadelphia, and some places in Ohio even, that in Boston, the headquarters was run out of a room in a suite in the Copley Square Hotel, which is in the Back Bay of Boston. And that's how the title comes about. The inspiration for the group, the formation of the group, comes from this gentleman, who's a Detroit priest named Father Charles Coughlin. He was really the first celebrity priest on the radio in the 1930s. He was a Canadian by birth, But he started a political party in America called the Union Party. And he always toggled back and forth between being a religious pastor and a political voice. My view is, I don't express this in the book, but I think he always wanted to run for president, but because of his Canadian birth, he couldn't do so. So he kind of had all these proxies that were working with him in his empire. He created a media empire. By the late 1930s, he had about 30 million listeners on the radio, which is, there were only 120 million people in the country at that point. He was extremely anti-Roosevelt after 1936. He was anti-communist and increasingly anti-Semitic after 1936, and also began working and receiving money from Nazi intelligence by 1938 and 1939. That was discovered by Donald Warren in his 1996 book about Coughlin. What I wanted to do was, my view was that there'd been enough books published about Coughlin that we know more about him than almost we need to know, but that this group that he formed, which was his paramilitary wing, had never been studied. And I thought that deserved some attention. So about 10 years before the book was published, I started digging around and trying to find the FBI file. I was told by multiple archivists and scholars that an FBI file did not exist, but I was able to track that down and receive it. And then I was also able to get Moran's FBI file released and Scholz's FBI file release. That process took 6 years to do, because it took about 2 years to get every one of the FBI files I needed to be released. So it was just 6 years to get the material from that government side. But I was also able to go to Germany and do research in the political archives of the Third Reich, and also look at some SS archives. So Coughlin is a Roman Catholic priest, and he's becoming blatantly anti-Semitic over the radio. And these are, when I'm writing the book, my big question was, how does this priest formulate a paramilitary, anti-Semitic paramilitary group who claim to be genuine Catholics? Like they're authentically Catholic in their propositions to publicly. They claim Catholicism as their guiding force. So what I did was I went back and I looked at the theological tenets. This is one of this is one of the foci of the book that I think is something that was missed when people even wrote biographies of Coughlin. They were too skittish about looking at the theological impulses that he operated under. And so what I wanted to do was bring theology back into the mix and show how Father Coughlin actually used theology to propel his followers towards this paramilitarism. These two theologies, these Catholic theologies, Catholic action, it's kind of a social uplift movement from the 1920s, which became increasingly more anti-communist. That was sponsored by the Pope, by both popes of that era. And then this mystical body of Christ theology. It's a theology that emerged in Catholicism after the turn of the 20th century, after about 1900, between 1900 and 1965. It was the dominant theology of Roman Catholics in the US. And I show in the book, I try to show in the book, how this theology was kind of transnational in nature. It made Christ transcend borders, that the concept of being baptized into Christ actually obliterated sense of sovereign borders and became a transnational mystical theology, so that if Catholics were physically being persecuted, particularly by communists anywhere in the world, albeit in Mexico or in Spain, then Catholics all over the globe would have felt that pain, based in the theology of St. Paul. And so I write about that in the beginning of the book, and I wrote a chapter on it so that it grounds the reader in why I think Coughlin was successful in this effort to gather followers who would also, followers of the gospel who would also pick up guns. That was one of my main interests. And so this is, for example, a front page photograph of the Christian Front at target practice. They're picking up guns. They're building bombs in their basement. They're creating plots. I mean, just the other day, there was an FBI indictment of, I think, a young man from Michigan who was kind of creating a similar anti-Semitic plot to kill Jews in a synagogue. That's what these folks aim to do as well. This is 1940. That indictment came out, I think, last week. And so it's not unheard of. But this case in 1940 was a pretty large plot. And as I write in the book, it was a very complicated set of principles that led to the plot. The FBI kind of swooped in and stormed their bomb-making lab in Brooklyn before they could actually set off bombs and kind of get their plot underway. But the FBI also did observe their paramilitary training sessions, which were done at gun ranges throughout West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and upstate New York. So we have all that information. Now, the historians through the years had downplayed this group. They just said that they were, because no bullets got fired and no bombs were detonated, that they didn't matter. And once I got their FBI file, I thought they mattered even more, because I could see the kind of level of violence that they were about to unleash. And I thought that the political historians who'd looked at this case, and there had been some, seemed to go with the contemporaneous newspaper reporting about the plot being inconsequential and ramshackle and laughable. And so subsequent historians kind of took that line as well. I thought differently, mainly because my first job was as a police officer in my hometown, and I'd been trained not on this weaponry, but I was being trained on semi-automatic weaponry. So I knew my way around like what a 30-06 bullet was, the damage it could do. And so I just was, I just thought that the historians had missed the boat on this. And that also comes out in the book. I just think the fact that they published a book on it is an indication that I think they missed the boat. There's religion comes into their target practice as well. They would meet at the firing range early in the morning on Sundays, break at 9 a.m. and go to church at a local church, and then come back in the afternoon and do more target practice and military rushes. Those are Springfield 1903 rifles, by the way. Those are kind of World War I era rifles, but they're a really excellent rifle. And one of those bullets will go through, each one of those bullets will go through a brick wall. That bullet that is shot from that gun is larger than the NATO round that is used today, even, and anyways can do more damage than the NATO round. The NATO round's smaller because they want to carry more of them. So these were the headlines, kind of coast to coast, in January of 1940. I go back and forth about the kind of the politicization of the plot. You know, was this the Roosevelt administration trying to take out these political opponents? Because the political section of the Christian Front, so which had about 100,000 members. There was this public-facing organization that had about 100,000 members at its height, 30,000 members really between 1938 and 1940. They were extremely anti-Roosevelt. And then within that public group, there were these cells, which were paramilitary cells, which were variously called the Action Committee, the Country Gentlemen, and they were they were being trained on bomb making and tactical weapons here, and so they the the public facing members of the group didn't really know anything about the fact that these paramilitary cells even existed. They were secretive within the organization, but the FBI was able to swing in and arrest them before they could kind of do their dirty work. You can read about the plot in the book. It's rather fascinating why they were doing this. Basically, they felt that there was going to be a communist, that every time Roosevelt appointed a communist, or excuse me, appointed anyone who was Jewish to his administration, they believed that any Jew was also a communist, that this issue of Judeo-Bolshevism was in play, and that every Jew was a communist and every communist was a Jew. It was a symbiotic relationship. So that was their impulse for trying to overthrow the Roosevelt administration. They were brought to trial and they were acquitted by and large. You can read about the case in the book. It's a fascinating story of kind of ineptitude on the part of the government, and also the fact that the foreperson of the jury was a Christian Front member's, a very prominent Christian Front member's first cousin. But the other part is that the prosecutor, the government prosecutor, was inept in my view. But religion played into it, and you can read about that in the book. So then the FBI was able to, and the Justice Department was able to shut them down in New York, where they had a great deal of publicity. There was also a branch in Boston. And so after the New York trial, which concluded in June of 1940, the movement epicenter moved up to Boston. And that's where Francis Moran was the lieutenant for the Coughlin organization, the Coughlin political organization in Boston. And he went to Royal Oak, Michigan, and met secretly with Father Coughlin, and was commissioned to be what I call the lieutenant of the Christian Front in Boston. There were similar folks that were commissioned by Coughlin to be, to be more truculent, more militaristic. He had a similar in New York. You can read about them in the book. Rather fascinating street level characters, which historians have never written about. So people like Moran's counterpart in New York was a guy named John F. Cassidy. No one's really written about these people. They're kind of street level, ordinary, working class, paramilitarized Catholic anti-communists. And they're vehemently anti-Semitic. And because of this concept of Judeo-Bolshevism, when you argue that they're anti-Semitic, they say, we're not anti-Semitic, we're anti-communist. And that's how they pull it off publicly, but inwardly, in their interior, they're extremely anti-Semitic. And so I do believe that it was an organization based in anti-Semitic paramilitarism. When it moves up to Boston, there are a couple of things in play. In the book, I record about how it probably should have gone out of business because Moran was hemorrhaging cash, and the organization was about to go out of existence because the Catholic Church in Boston simply wouldn't accept it. And then what happened was Nazi intelligence triggered their man in Boston, who was the consul, to go recruit Moran. And that was a successful recruitment. And again, no one has known about this until 2021. As far as I know, maybe some of the listeners can fill me in. I really don't know of any other kind of operational relationship between a German intelligence officer, and Scholz was a member of the SS intelligence, and an American citizen that was fruitful for the Nazis during that period, as we'll see. So this is, again, Scholz, who we met earlier. This is his lineage, though. In the book, you can read about how he was recruited to the Brown Shirts by Ernst Röhm. I don't mention this in the book, but subsequent to the publication, it's come out. He had a romantic relationship with Ernst Röhm, and by 1932, Scholz had moved up to a high level in the brown shirts, to the point where Röhm supported his effort, Scholz's effort, to go get a PhD in psychology at the University of Leipzig, which is interesting in and of itself. And once he got his PhD by 1934, he's getting poached by the SS because Himmler wanted all of those kind of more prestigious, affluent. Scholz was from a fabulously wealthy family in Bavaria. He wanted those types of people in the SS because he wanted to impress Hitler more and become the center of power. And then Scholz's first job after he gets his PhD is to work as the secretary to Rudolf Hess, right in what they call the Brown House, right there in Berlin. And he did that for about 2 years before he was assigned to Boston to become consul in 1938. And so he really worked as one of Hess's primary intelligence officers through the 1930s, and then entered the SS and worked in intelligence, the SS. And he was sent to Boston in 1938 for reasons that had nothing to do with Moran or the Christian Front, but rather Heinrich Brüning, the former chancellor of Germany, had fled and started, in his exile, started teaching in the political science department at Harvard University. And after Kristallnacht, he started making more anti-Hitler speeches in Boston and on the East Coast. And so Himmler and others sent Scholz to Boston to run an intimidation campaign against Brüning, which you can read about in the book. It's chilling what he was doing and how it turned out. And Brüning plays actually a pretty major role in the book in connection to both Moran.
Charles, I don't know if you can hear us, but
And Scholz. Again, nobody knew anything. Again, his father is a manufacturer of train carriages. It's saying that my internet connection is unstable, so I'll double check it here. Seems to be back stable again. This is his wife. This is Scholz's wife, Lilo von Schnitzler. Her father, Scholz turned state's evidence against her father, who was the commercial chairman of IG Farben, the chemical company. And her von Schnitzler's, Lilo's father, gets 7 years at Nuremberg by the end of the war as a war criminal. The marriage did not survive Herbert Scholz's turning of state's evidence against his father-in-law, as you might expect, but we'll get more to that later. This is a picture of Scholz in the that's in the consulate in Boston in 1941, just before he's sent to leave. This is the consulate in 1940, right after the invasion of the Low Countries. FBI surveillance on the consulate was very poor. FBI, Scholz and Moran ran circles around the FBI, any kind of FBI surveillance. I get into that in the book as to why. I just think that the FBI SAC, the special agent in charge in Boston, was inept in terms of counterintelligence and counterespionage, which you can read about in the book. So here's some stats on what's going on by 1940 and 1941. And then keeping in mind here, I have a list here of 5 different intelligence agencies that were surveilling both Moran and Scholz during the 1940s, really 1930s and late 1930s, 1940s. And none of these agencies ever came to the conclusion that Scholz was running Moran as an agent. Every one of them got it wrong. They missed it. And what I was able to dig up shows the kind of continuity of their relationship and the fruitfulness of their relationship in terms of both espionage and propaganda. This is a really cool piece of the book. All I'll say is, if you can read the book, go to the part on the Johnson semi-automatic rifle. This is really cool because Melvin Maynard Johnson is a Boston engineer who designs this rifle to try to compete with the M1 Garand as the main battle rifle for the U.S. Army. So I don't want to get in the woods too much, but suffice to say, for the World War II crowd here, there's this really cool set of circumstances where Scholes and Moran try to, through the Christian front, public pressure, end up trying to push the U.S. Army to choose the Johnson rifle over the Garand, mainly because the Germans had captured 30,000 Johnson rifles when they invaded the Netherlands. And as some of you may know, they had a hard time, A, creating their own semi-automatic rifle, and B, trying to get the specs to the M1 Garand. They didn't have that. They didn't have the tech specs to the Garand, but they had 30,000 Johnsons. So Moran and Scholes start this publicity campaign, letter writing campaign, pressuring Congress, letters to the editor, letters to Congress people about the adoption of the Johnson rifle. It's a really cool situation. This is because this is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate Arms Committee, I'm sorry, making decisions about which gun is going to be adopted by the Army. And they even went out to the Maryland testing ground and shot the rifles. Members of Congress, various members of Congress actually shot the rifles out there. So here's kind of the equation. You can read about all that in the book. It was unsuccessful, but I thought it was just really interesting how these religious people start pushing the government to adopt a battle rifle. And not only interesting, but basically what I was trying to do was, historians such as Joseph Nye, they always argue that religion has nothing to do with warfare. The only things really connected to warfare on the battlefield are military decisions and economic decisions. And that was a clear case of a religious organization trying to impact the dynamism of the battlefield, about what rifle is going to be adopted. So Scholes was an expert spy master, an expert intimidator. This little slide is about Hugh Clegg, the FBI assistant director, who had recruited a contact who was being recruited by Scholes to be in Scholes's inner circle. And that contact basically faltered and refused to be a recruit of Scholes's because he feared for his life. And then secondly, in 1940 and 41, you had the visit of another person nobody knows about, but was Hitler's personal courier for the Wehrmacht, a guy named Fritz Fenthal. He actually came to Boston in 1940, stayed 4 days with Scholes at Scholes's mansion in Chestnut Hill, which is right near Boston College where I teach. It's a beautiful house. It's like a 10-minute walk from where I'm talking. And Fenthal came to Boston and encouraged Scholes to pick up the pace on the infiltration and espionage against military targets in New England. And right after Fenthal left, after 4 days in Boston, that's what Scholes did. You can read about in the book all the military installations he infiltrated. He infiltrated a lot of. He had agents get into the R&D work that was being done at MIT and at Harvard for development of weapon systems, and the FBI did not let that information out until after the war was over. The FBI found out about it around 1943, 44, but they thought it was so sensitive that they didn't let even the State Department know about it until the war had concluded. And so this is Fenthal. There's a good article written on him in the Journal of Intelligence History recently by a guy named Jonathan Brown down in Texas. So what he had also, what Sholes had Moran do was give religious lectures at military and naval bases throughout New England. And, you know, it sounds silly to us, but the Germans didn't have that nitty gritty intelligence about what US bases looked like. They didn't have even kind of basic, intelligence just on these matters. And so Sholes had Moran go give religious lectures all throughout New England. And that's how he got into the compounds, got into the bases. And then he got debriefed by Sholes when he came back, and Sholes sent all of that information back to Berlin. What happens, though, in the middle of all this to disrupt the Moran-Sholes nexus is that Sir William Stevenson, who is head of MI6 in New York, British passport control, he gets wind of the uptick in Christian Front membership, which is happening after the acquittal of the Christian Front members in the trial in New York. After the trial in New York, membership just skyrocketed, particularly in New England. And then in June 1940, a Jesuit priest at Boston College, I also am a Jesuit priest at Boston College, but one of my former confreres, Reverend Michael Ahern, gave a speech over the radio that indicated that it was morally permissible for Catholics to rejoin the Christian Front. Despite the fact that they were anti-Semitic, the fact that they were anti-communistic made it amenable for Catholics to join morally. So the membership skyrocketed. Stevenson heard that speech, and that's when he pushed the British to form a counter organization to the Christian Front in both New York and particularly in Boston. And so they came up with this creation of the Irish American Defense Association, which was kind of a neighborhood watch organization, kind of a patriotic, but at the neighborhood level, at the very nitty gritty level, street level, activism. And so that's what they did. And they were quite successful in creating this group. And let's see here. And this is, these are some of the documents I was able to find. These files got released in 2016, 2017 by the British. I could talk about these more later. One thing I found out was if you're going to set up a super secret spy organization, the best place to keep your files is to label them miscellaneous. But you'll see, you know, your members may see these are SOE documents I'm using, and I can talk about that in the Q&A, why the SOE had these documents, the Special Operations Executive, rather than MI6, because there's a whole backstory to that too. So these are onion skin copies of the back and forth between MI6 and in the US and in Britain. And these are, and this is giving kind of 48,000 is Stevenson's code name. And then these are all the other code names. No one would have been able to figure out who you was. I actually was able to figure that out with the help of Christopher Andrew over at Cambridge, who's the expert on MI6 and World War II. He was very helpful, I got to say. So this is all done at the highest level. You know, Churchill would have been, you know, Churchill's undersecretary gave the okay for it, Alexander Cadogan. They couldn't find anybody to lead the organization in Boston until they landed on this young woman, Catholic woman named Frances Sweeney. She's a liberal Catholic. She leaned communist, which is extraordinarily rare in America in the 1930s. And her story is also told in the book, which is quite extraordinary. She believed that anti-Semitism on the part of Catholics was a sin. So she readily agreed to lead the Irish American Defense Association. She had no idea that she was working for the British. She was totally unwitting, and she had been recruited to the Irish American Defense Association through a cutout. Who was working for an American who was working for British intelligence. And she ran that organization like a dynamo, and she protested all of the Christian Front meetings. She created a kind of a juggernaut within the journalistic community in Boston to get the Christian Front shut down. And you can read about that whole campaign in the book. This is the letterhead of the Irish American Defense Association, or American Irish Defense, that I found in the secret files in London. And this is signed by Frances Sweeney. And this was sent over to London through her cutout. I have an idea who the cutout was, but I wasn't 100% certain who the cutout was, so I didn't put that in the book. And then this is what they wanted to do. The MI6 and Stevenson wanted to pressure local police, the local police commissioner and the Massachusetts Attorney General to get the Christian Front shut down. And they kind of created a pressure campaign, the MI6 did, on the police commissioner mainly, Joseph Timilty, who was a close friend of Joe Kennedy. He wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, Timilty, and he went ahead and detained Moran for handing out what he called Nazi propaganda, but actually wasn't. Because the Nazi who had published the book had only been indicted and not convicted, and so Timilty kind of falsely arrested Moran, and Moran was able to, of course, use that against Timilty to talk his way out of it. This is just kind of an aside, but the Russians get involved here too, because Moran never goes to jail. Timilty detained him and took a statement from Moran, but he couldn't arrest him because Moran hadn't broken any laws. First Amendment protected all that speech in his Christian Front meetings. But the Russians wanted him arrested. So this guy, John Franklin Carter, was a syndicated columnist who was also Roosevelt's personal intelligence chief. He tried to influence John W. McCormick, the later Speaker of the House, to get Moran arrested, both for sedition and also for Moran's potential to inspire the assassination of the president. You can see that here in the slide. So no one knew this until about 10 years ago, but Carter, who met with President Roosevelt every 6 days when he was in the White House, and provided him personal intelligence report. He's run by GRU. He's a full-fledged GRU Russian intelligence agent. I mean, talk about Russian collusion. It's not even collusion. This is like basically Russian operational work right in the West Wing, and nobody knows about this guy. This is kind of, so I wanted to put that in because Boston is front and center in that, and Moran and all that. And you can read about this in the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. Really interesting article by Gene Coyle done about 10 years ago. So one of the issues here, and I know I only have 5 minutes left, so one of the things that comes out of the intelligence operation run by the British is that when the British succeed in getting Moran taken off the playing field, I argue in the book that what happens is two things. Moran goes underground and the Christian Front atomizes into gang warfare. So in the spring, summer, and fall of 1943, what you have in Boston is this emergence of Catholic and Irish Catholic on Jewish violence, which is quite considerable. In a number of neighborhoods, riots are taking place. Okay, here we go. Anti-Semitic rioting in Boston. Riots are taking place. Jewish youth are getting beat up all over the city. Property damage is occurring in Jewish neighborhoods. Anti-Semitic symbolism is occurring in in Jewish neighborhoods. And then finally, in the fall of 1943, it comes to a head with this headline in the New York periodical PM, which I think it's all pretty much considered now to be a communist organization, or communist CPUSA propped up front organization, PM Daily. Had good circulation and had really good cultural impact in the U.S. But this is the headline about the Boston riots. And so this is another. There was a U.S. Army counterintelligence officer from Boston who died like 25 years ago. And instead of sending his archive to Washington, he did a kind of a Mar-a-Lago thing and kept it at his summer residence. And apparently his papers eventually ended up at his alma mater at the University of New Hampshire. And so I was able to look at all his, I mean, these documents all should have been sent back to Washington. But thankfully he didn't do that. And I was able to read the reports on the Jewish rioting up there in these papers of this former U.S. Army CIC agent. And I argue in the book that basically the rioting in Boston is due to a very seamlessly and beautifully run British intelligence operation. But Moran is still hanging out there. He's underground, and I know I only have a couple minutes left, but I think Moran is more dangerous underground than he is above ground. This is from his FBI file, and this is what he's saying. By 1943, Moran is now underground, but he's talking about exterminating Jews in the United States. And again, this is an FBI informant, T1. We don't have any idea who T1 is, because at the time that this report was filed, T1 was afraid for their life that Moran would have them, and that Scholes in particular would have them taken out and liquidated. This is kind of, I think, one of the reasons why the Christian Front was forgotten. Nobody wanted to publicly come out against either Moran or Scholes because they were afraid for their lives. And every time the FBI, or particularly US, the naval intelligence, was able to get close, none of the informants said that they would be willing to publicly speak in a trial and testify against either Moran or Scholes. So the whole case got lost due to this lethality aspect. How Scholes ends up is really interesting too. He first goes to Buenos Aires and has a 6-month, after the war, I should say, when the war starts to end, he's actually in Italy. He gets arrested by the US. He gets rearrested, which is a fascinating tale, because James Jesus Angleton, who later becomes head of CIA counterintelligence, is chasing Scholes all through in Italy. And you can read about that in the book. It's a fascinating story about how he evades interrogation with Angleton. That's just a really cool story. He eventually gets a letter of recommendation from Cardinal Fossati, which gets him sprung from an American camp, in addition to his, again, giving information to the Americans about his father-in-law, von Schnitzler, the commercial chief of IG Farben. He eventually ends up in Buenos Aires for 6 months, having a fling with the former wife of the fashion designer Oleg Cassini, who some of you may remember. And then Cassini designed all of Jackie Onassis's hats and dresses. Then he dumps her and goes to Bolivia, and in collusion with the Krupp family, he buys a copper mine in Bolivia. And then when a communist government takes over in 1958 in Bolivia, he goes back to Germany, and the new German Democratic Republic lets him in and gives him his pension. He claims a pension as a diplomat because he was the consul in Boston, and he gets his pension, and he buys a villa on the shores of Lake Starnberg and kind of lives there for the rest of his time. So this is the piece I like to end on. This is a line from a letter written by the, it's saying that my internet connection, I hope it's better now. This
good.
is, okay, so this is written by the fiance of Francis Sweeney, who's our kind of hero or heroine of the book. And she dies suddenly in 1944. She has a heart attack while walking down the street in Boston. And her fiance writes, "It just doesn't seem right that one who could see so much evil around her and spared neither time nor courage to fight it should suddenly be taken away. To us who are left behind, her deeds should be a challenge to carry on the good work that she started." So on that, I will conclude and be delighted to entertain any questions you might have, and I'll stop the sharing too.
All right. Please unmute yourselves. I'll start with a question. In your book, which I'm not all the way through, you take a pretty, or it seems to me, a pretty harsh stand against the Catholic Church and their position. How were you received when you took that position?
Yeah, so the reason that I take a harsh stand is it is grounded in two circumstances. First of all, in this material, which had heretofore been kept secret, there is huge evidence of Catholic anti-Semitism. So it's clear that these Christian Front members are authentically and virulently anti-Semitic. And that's a major force driving their paramilitarism and eventually driving Moran towards exterminationism. The second reason is that since 1998, the Vatican has not recognized Catholic anti-Semitism as being evident as underpinning the Holocaust. And they wrote a statement in 1998, "We remember reflections on the Shoah." And while it admits anti-Judaism, which is a religious disdain for things Jewish, it never indicates, and this is still today the official view of the Vatican, that Catholics were anti-Semitic, that they were racially anti-Semitic. And I could never buy that as a historian, as a scientific historian. And so when I saw the preponderance and the adumbration of evidence about these people who were going to mass every day, clearly going to mass every Sunday, they had priests advising them, priest philosophers advising them. They were authentically claiming their Catholicism, but also being racially anti-Semitic and working with the Nazis. I decided to just put it out there and just say, hey, this is what I'm finding. This is the evidence. And I did not in my book call out the Vatican on that statement, but it was in the back of my mind, and I have publicly made comments about that. And that's kind of how I feel about it. How it's been received is I sent a copy of the book to Cardinal O'Malley here in Boston, because I figured, this is about the history of his archdiocese. So I shouldn't kind of do this as subterfuge. I should. So I
blindsided him, right?
Yeah. So I sent him a copy. He sent me back a really warmly written, handwritten note, where he indicated that perhaps it's best for light to be shone upon such darkness, as he put it, which I thought was extremely broad-minded.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
So I also wonder if the concept of Judeo-Bolshevism, if Marx never existed, would the Catholic Church still, well, in recent times, yes, would the Catholic Church still, and these members like Moran, still be as anti-Semitic, or were they anti-Semitic because of the concept that communism and Judaism were synonymous?
Yeah. So I get into that in the first couple of chapters where I write about the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. And what's happening is that, particularly in the Russian Civil War, the people who were over in Russia at the time were Protestant evangelical missionaries. So, for example, when the Russian Civil War broke out, it was all these, the Associated Press reporter who filed stories was a guy named William Dudley Pelley, who founded the Silver Shirts. And he was working for the YMCA. And what they were seeing was that the Red Army was trying to exterminate Orthodox Christianity. And so many of these evangelicals, and later who had influence on Catholics in this way, they argued that the existential threat to Christianity as a whole was the Red Army. And that they saw that they saw the Red Army's campaign against the Orthodox Church in Russia as a precursor to the Russian, the Bolshevik style in the West. And so I show what I call ecumenical anti-communism happening as early as the 1920s and 1930s, whereas Richard Hofstadter, the famous Columbia historian, he sees that happening in 1950s with McCarthy. I say no. It's you can show the Catholic right and the evangelical right coming together in the 1920s in the wake of the Russian Civil War, because they saw the Bolshevik campaign against Orthodox Christianity as a campaign against all Christians globally. They had no bones about it. They knew that they thought this is a global issue right now, and that's how they approached it. So that's kind of how I write about it in the book.
If anybody has questions, if you haven't unmuted yourselves, I can unmute you. I can request you to unmute yourselves. This way you can be heard, or you could send a chat if you can't do that. Are there any other questions? Anybody have any?
I scribbled a note down fairly early, but really intriguing topic that I knew nothing about. So this was a good day already. Would you characterize the organization, the Christian Front organization, as being a conflation, or was it a pick your issue? Anti-Semitism, populism, anti-communism, Christian militarism. Is it a smorgasbord, or does it pick up its adherents by appealing to a specific element that appeals to the follower?
Yeah, in the book, the way I write the book is I believe the main driver is anti-Semitism, and I believe that that's the only reason that Moran and Scholes are able to work together, or that's the main reason. The anti-communism comes in, but keep in mind too that during the period of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Scholes was recruiting communist spies in Boston as well. If he had told Moran that he was also recruiting communists, Moran would have left, would have bolted. I'm sure of it. The main driver, however, and the main appeal that Scholes was able to push over onto Moran was the anti-Semitic appeal, which was biblically grounded. It was also theologically grounded at the time, because the Catholics all believed that the Jews had crucified Christ, had killed Christ. The deicide that theology doesn't change until 1965. And we also have to consider that too, that the religious principles of the day are totally different from what's going on today. But that's a really good question. And when I wrote the book, I wanted to show anti-Semitism as the gateway into Nazism for these Catholics, because they had no compunction about working with Scholz, no compunction about working with a Nazi SS officer. But the Nazi racialism too was not grounded in. So one of the things that comes up in the book, which I found fascinating, is that Nazi racialism does not work into, for the Christian front members, into white supremacy. So most of my readers say, well, then they're also going to be white supremacists. No. For these Catholics, because they believe in the universality of baptism, they have recruitment drives in Harlem for the Christian front. Because once you're baptized, then you're a member of the club, regardless of skin color, So it's kind of a crazy book.
That's a really good, if I may, with one more, that's just,
sure.
You couldn't have set me up for this question better.
Yeah.
Okay. I would consider Pius XII's position confusing at different periods through World War II.
Right.
Let's just leave it at that, confusing. Does he appear anywhere in the research you did? Does he have any commentary? Does he provide any direction? And what might that have been?
So that's a great question. The short of it is, my treatment is, okay, my first book was called Vatican Secret Diplomacy. It was about Pope Pius XII. This book, the sources I were finding were interesting to me because they were street level sources. They didn't deal with diplomats and elites and popes and generals and secretaries of state. These were ordinary neighborhood people who were working class and usually never wrote anything down. If there weren't multiple scribes from multiple intelligence agencies writing down every word they said, we wouldn't know about it. The problem for this book was it was published in September of 2021. The archives for Pope Pius XII were opened in March of 2020. And you remember what also happened in March of 2020?
COVID.
The internet. Yeah. So the international pandemic came. So as I was about to go to the Vatican archives to research that part, everything got shut down. And my publisher, at this point, you have to make a decision. And my publisher, my editor in particular, thought I had so much good stuff. Every chapter is new news. And that's really hard to say about a World War II book these days in particular. So my editor just said, we don't know when this pandemic is going to end, but we can put you in the pipeline. And, they got to sell books. They needed product. So they thought it was pretty good. So they went ahead with it. So for the sequel, I would love to answer that question. I'd love to go back over and get the file. Yeah.
Was there any link between the German-American Bund and the front?
No, there wasn't, for two separate reasons. German intelligence in the US knew that the FBI was microscopically surveilling the Bund. The FBI looked for Germans in the usual German places. Their ability to detect intelligence operations outside of the norm were extremely limited. And so they were looking at the Bund, they were looking at the Italian American organizations. they never looked at a religious organization. They didn't think that a religious organization would be susceptible to infiltration, or that the Germans would have the savvy to actually work in the religious realm. And the second part of that is Moran was a US citizen, and there was this kind of naivete on the part of the FBI to think that in country-born Americans would never spy for a foreign country. But it was the religious component that allowed that, I argue. And I think, the Germans were pretty savvy to exploit that particular piece. The histories of German intelligence in the US that were published in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think are inadequate. And I've found just the opposite. They kind of explain those operations and as being kind of amateurish and clownish and stumbling. But I found in Scholl's, I found just the opposite. He was a master spy. He had a PhD in psychology. You should read about in the book about, I was able to get a copy of his doctoral thesis, and it's a study in how to turn a target psychologically. Wow. It's wild. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? Or if you want, you could tell us why the SOE had those documents instead of MI6.
Yeah, so basically, all of the original documents were to have been burned. So they were housed in Rockefeller Center at MI6 headquarters. After the war, they were put on tractor trailers and trucked up to Toronto, to a British base outside of Toronto called Camp X-Ray. And any kind of material that was derogatory or indicated illegality, because the whole operation they were doing was illegal, that was to be destroyed. But Stevenson, through his time in New York, was such a climber. He was, in my view, he was an excellent spy, but he had a number of insecurities, and he always wanted to prove himself to Churchill. So whenever he had a success with a clandestine operation in America, he always sent copies of the reports to SOE, which was Churchill's domain, so that he could show Churchill what he was doing and rise in the estimation of Churchill. So due to Stevenson's megalomania, or for lack of a better word, is why we have those copies. And I was able to kind of track it down, because they didn't destroy the SOE files. The SOE files were classified and kept secret for 70 years, maybe, I think 75 years.
All right.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank Dr. Gallagher for a really informative and enlightening presentation. It was fantastic. A lot of stuff I never knew about, and I'm sure most of our members didn't either, because this is not the normal realm that we delve in. And so that's what makes it always so interesting to have people like yourselves, inform us. So if there are no other questions, I'll touch base with you regarding the honorarium and all that. So
okay.
I'll send you an email.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been a real
pleasure. Thank you all for participating, and I'll send out an email with next month's link we have another speaker for July. Thank you very much, all. We're ending this.
Very much enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Very good.
Thank you. Terrific.